Good morning.
Good morning.
When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied, and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this: 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and then followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Hosanna!
Hosanna! You see? She did it. You can do it too. You know, there are so many different interpretations. Let alone in the Gospels, we see Palm Sunday happening in slightly different ways in each of the Gospels. And in this particular one, you see Jesus telling the disciples to go get a donkey and a colt. And it says in the reading that he is riding on both of them on the way in. Well, one of the interpretations I had read this week was, and I think it was the first time I had read this one, it may be very old, I don't know. But a general would enter a city riding his mount, his horse, and if you were of anyone of importance and you were a true warrior, you would always have a second mount following you in case the first one was struck down in battle. So this is a possible explanation of a donkey and a colt, but both were far from the large horses that a warrior would be riding into town. So I'm going to return to a favorite message from Palm Sunday that you have heard. You may not remember it, but you have heard it before. I hope you don't mind. He came to Jerusalem that day, a day like many others, and a day that would stand out for many reasons in the years to come. He had come to sell his wares in the markets of Jerusalem, a teeming mass of daily life and Passover preparation. Yes, like a supermarket before the year's first snowstorm, and the mall on the day after Thanksgiving, Jerusalem was bustling with people who were preparing for, you name it, guests, strangers, family, and celebration. He came with a full load. These special festivals were a great time to earn extra money for the family. There were special sacrifices to be made in order to please God. And it cost a great deal of money for him to purchase an animal, spotless and without blemish, to be taken to the temple as an offering. And of course, there was the extra food and the ceremonial foods to be used in the Passover meal. So much to do, yet, and he still had to sell all that he could in order to turn a tidy profit. And then there was the other trouble of the crowds. Whenever festival days approached and he took extra wares into Jerusalem, he had to be very careful of the thieves who could easily walk away with all of his prized possessions of the strong donkey and its colt. That donkey and the colt, they were workhorses, they were, and everybody knew it. While he was able to stack so much on their backs that the other vendors often offered him great sums of money to buy them. He knew a good thing when he saw it, though. By the grace of God, he had received these beasts of burden from his cousin, who had repaid him for his kindness when the cousin was down on his luck. His cousin was now successful at breeding animals of all sorts, and the best went to his dear cousin, for without such kindness, he would never have survived that difficult time. Our vendor was proud of these animals, not only for what they could do and the attention they brought him because of other vendors' jealousy, but they represented to him a kind of a symbol of God's goodness. Long ago, you see, his father had taught him that God would care for the man who cared for others. God will show great care for the righteous, his father used to say. It certainly seemed true. His kindness had now begun to put him ahead for the first time. He continued bartering with the many people who were trying to shout out their demands of lower prices. And he thought to himself, where do they think they are? Walmart? But it was a good day for the vendors. In seller's market, as they say, and he was already making far more money than he thought he could for that very day. And then he saw them approaching. It was out of the corner of his eye. He could spot them often far before they were close enough to do harm. Thieves with a lust for his goods weren't able to hide their desire from his gaze. But these two exhibited signs far beyond the common criminal that alarmed him. He could tell they had their eyes on his prized donkey and on the colt. They made no effort to conceal their admiration, and they even, what does that look like, he thought to himself. Why, it looks like they're relieved to see them. Well, you know, he kept a hefty club next to himself in his kiosk. It wasn't uncommon to have to convince freeloaders and pickpockets to clear away from his area. And then there were the types who were looking to relieve him of his prized possessions. Why, twice the previous week, in far less crowded instances, he had chased and even got a crack at two thieves who had dared to touch the bridle on his beast. Slowly, he grasped the club at his side with one hand as he accepted some payment for a trifle from another customer. He moved carefully close to the other side of the kiosk, where the animals were tethered, trying not to look directly at the thieves who he saw were actually smiling and laughing and speaking aloud of their relief that his animals were so easy to find. As they drew close, the thieves were now standing right next to his animals. He raised the club to his waist level, and he readied himself to inflict as much pain on the one that touched his beast first. It was then that conversation across on the other side of the kiosk somehow got his attention. One woman was speaking very loudly. She said, "Did you hear about the fellow Jesus of Nazareth?" Our vendor had heard of Jesus of Nazareth. "I heard he was on his way here to Jerusalem." "Why, I actually hear that several people are planning to meet him at the outer entrance to welcome him and to celebrate his coming." Well, he was so distracted by this news that not only did his gaze no longer fall on the thieves, but he also realized that his club had rested back on the ground. "A lot of good a rested club will do for me," he thought, as he returned his interest to the thieves. Now, to his surprise, those thieves had not laid a hand on his beasts. In fact, these men were looking him directly in the eyes with soft smiles and confident expectation. "Good day, sir," they said first. "Good day," he also spoke in return. He opened his mouth, but by then he was confused that they hadn't tried to make the steal. He was still thinking of the ladies who had distracted him with their mentions of Jesus' name. And to top it all off, they seemed to be quite friendly fellows, not the like of which thieves are usually made. What followed was a simple exchange. It actually took only a few seconds. And when it was over, he turned to his customers, and with a feeling of fullness and fulfillment and graciousness, he didn't even flinch as his treasured donkey and the colt were led away by the men who he first had pegged as thieves. He was at peace, far more than he had ever experienced in his life. And as he now cheerfully bartered with his demanding customers, he began to laugh aloud, thinking, "Now my God has surely spoken directly to me." His fellow vendor in the next stall saw the donkey and the colt being led away. So surprised to see them out of sight of the vendor, he yelled over him, "What are they doing? They're walking away with your beasts!" And our vendor, he just smiled at him and he said, "It's okay. They told me that the Lord needs them." In that moment of exchange, that moment between the ladies speaking of Jesus and our vendors handing over the reins to the men, he had played many events over in his head, and in the end, he had imagined his Father's words yet once again. It was in those brief moments of revelation and thankfulness that his God had spoken to him, and his heart had opened to an extravagant gift giving. You see, long ago, he had been traveling with his valuable product stacked upon the precious beasts. He came down across a large gathering of people. Many of them were down and out types, the kind that rarely made it into the city. They were pagans, really, the ones that lived outside of town. They were listening to a fellow atop a rise in the plain, and he got there as the fellow from Nazareth, as he was told, was speaking words he had really only heard from his days in Torah school. The words were like a prophet's. A prophet who sounded gracious and caring like the prophets of old. He spoke words of peace to the meek and to those who were in mourning. He spoke words that were kind and gentle, and were words that he had longed to hear spoken aloud, because his heart had felt this way in his most vulnerable and tender of moments. He later heard more about giving alms and how to care for treasures. This fellow told the crowds that giving was to be done quietly and generously, without fear. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. His beloved father would have admired this fellow. In that moment between the ladies and handing over the donkey and the colt, our vendor continued thinking back on the days and the months following that chance happening when he had first encountered Jesus. As a vendor in the markets of Jerusalem, he had heard of all the so-called prophets and the healers and the con men too that were flashes in the pan. Everyone talked, but few had anything other than great awe for this fellow Jesus. His father used to say, "You will know a man not only by his words, but by his service to others." He recounted the stories he had heard from the people who bartered with him of Jesus curing someone on the Sabbath. This Jesus was a courageous man. He thought about how he had heard of the testimonies of several lame people who had always been customers, who came to his booth one day, no longer lame, all claiming that Jesus had cured them. He heard that twice, not once, but twice, that Jesus had somehow provided a multitude of people with only the smallest portions of food. Strangely enough, one of Jesus' tales about throwing seed had actually found its root inside of him. Our vendor had begun to believe that there was something special about this fellow Jesus. It was at about this moment that the words of his father intruded upon his memories of Jesus, and at the same time as the first man had made a request of him, almost simultaneously, his father's teaching and the man's request spoke to him directly. He was able to decipher later that the man had asked, "May I take these fine animals? The Lord needs them." And in his memory, his father's teaching spoke at the same time. God will show great care for the righteous. It was far deeper than a knee-jerk reaction, and certainly was one that didn't take into account a desire for which to be rewarded. Instead, our vendor was transformed in that moment by a deep desire to be an agent of God's reward. For he didn't care to be seen, nor did he consider the value of righteousness in his actions. It was in Jesus' kindness and generosity. It was in Jesus' compassion. It was in Jesus' name that our vendor saw righteousness and offered up to God, offered up to his new Lord, his most prized and valued possessions. And on his smiling lips, from his deepest root, came these words: Hosanna! Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. So we do so now, once again, from our deepest roots, with our palms in our hands, with our hearts in our mouth, and with love in our being. Let us say Hosanna 3 times. Hosanna! 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 Friends, let us sing our next hymn. You may remain seated as we sing